The last thing I want to talk about relevant to the pumping of protons is a related process that occurs in plants. Now, plants have mitochondria just like animal cells do, but in addition, plants have chloroplasts. And chloroplasts, you remember, are the locations where photosynthesis is occurring. And photosynthesis is a marvelous, incredible process, just like electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation are incredible processes. And what's remarkable about photosynthesis is the similarity or the parallels that the process has to the processes of electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation that I've been talking about. So let's briefly consider that. As I start talking about this, I want you to realize that we are not going to worry about memorizing names of all of these compounds that are shown on the screen. That is really not a subject of this class. What I want you instead to focus on is what's happening in the process and how is the synthesis of ATP facilitated. Well, as we look at the process, there's a couple things that are on the screen that are labeled that I want you to understand. One is over here. It's something called photosystem 2, or labeled PS2 on the screen. And the second thing is PS1, which stands for photosystem 1. It's in these two photosystems where the photons of light, the energy from them, is captured and used to drive, ultimately, the synthesis of ATP and NADPH. So if we look at this process that's happening, the overall process actually starts in photosystem 2, way over here, okay? In photosystem 2, it absorbs a photon of light, and in the process of absorbing that photon of light, what happens is it activates or it stimulates a couple of things. So one of the things that it stimulates is the movement of electrons, very much like we saw in the case of the mitochondria in electron transport. The movement of those electrons, however, in the chloroplast stimulates something else to happen. The stimulation of that process causes water, H2O, shown down over here, to be converted into oxygen. So the very first step of this process in the in the chloroplast is the formation of oxygen. Okay, so this is the way that plants are making molecular oxygen. Stimulation of electrons. The replacement of those lost electrons by the stimulation results in the splitting of water to make a molecular oxygen, as you can see here. As a consequence, molecular oxygen is liberated. Meanwhile, the electrons start passing through a series of carriers, very much like what we saw in the electron transport system of mitochondria. And one place in these carriers, right here, where this thing is labeled PQ and PQH2, which I'm not really concerned about you memorizing, I do want you to recognize that the movement of electrons through this system is causing the pumping of protons. Now, in electron transport in mitochondria, we saw the protons were pumped from the matrix into the intermembrane space. That is, that they were pumped out of the matrix and into the intermembrane space. In the chloroplast, the sort of opposite of that happens. Instead of protons being pumped from inside out, the inside of the chloroplast here could be considered the thylakoid lumen, and outside would be considered the stroma over here. Instead of being pumped outwards, protons in this process that we're talking about here are pumped inwards, okay? Well, the effect is the same. We're creating a proton gradient, except in this case, the concentration of protons is greater on the inside than it is on the outside. The effect is still the same. There's a lot of potential energy that is realized as a result of that difference in protons. Meanwhile, the electrons pass through several carriers, and we can see ultimately that the terminal electron acceptor for this process that we're seeing here, the terminal electron acceptor, is NADP to form NADPH. So in this is also called, by the way, the light cycle of photosynthesis. Here in the light cycle of photosynthesis, we're seeing something happening that is really very backwards to what's happening in electron transport. Remember, in electron transport, we started with electrons from an electron carrier. They passed through complexes, and they ultimately got donated to oxygen to make water. What are we doing here? We're starting with water. We are taking electrons from that, so water is the electron donor. light energy is needed to grab those electrons and pass them through. The movement of the electrons through the complexes causes protons to be pumped, just as before, except for now they're being pumped inside instead of being pumped outside. And finally, those electrons pass through a series of carriers and get donated to NADP to make NADPH. So it's backwards to the mitochondrial system, to the system that occurs in the mitochondrion, but the effect is still the same. We have high energy molecules that are produced as a result of this movement of materials. In the case of electron transport, those high energy molecules are ultimately ATP. And guess what? The same high energy molecules are made in this process. But instead of protons moving from the outside in, protons in this case are moving from the inside out. But look at that. There's that little turbine that I talked about before that rotates, and we see the same thing in the chloroplast that we saw in the mitochondrion. The rotating turbine causes ADP to be converted into ATP, just like it happened in the mitochondrial cells.